Excited about getting the story of David and Bathsheba and all of that, but that's coming. But we're looking at this whole thing of from the pasture to the palace, because remember, he was a shepherd boy, and just looking back at we've had 5 lessons up to this point. We're headed into our 6th today. Today we're going to be talking about responding properly to your enemies, and how do you handle it when somebody mistreats you. I know for a fact that there's people in this building right now who are really under it when it comes to being mistreated, and they're being lied about, and there's somebody slandering them, and you know, if you haven't ever had that done, then just hold on for the ride, because you probably will at some point or another, but it's hard. So how do we handle that? Before we talk about that, though, I want to just kind of look back for a minute and talk about this. Now, this slide, I kind of like to design this because what you see is a shepherd boy emerging into a king. It didn't just happen. God didn't just call this little shepherd boy out in the field and say, all right, you know what, go take the throne, squirt. And now Saul, obviously, King Saul turned his back on God. But what was the problem with the Israelite people? I mean, they wanted a king, right? And so they chose this king by how? His physical appearance. He was so big and tall and handsome, and so everybody chose him because of that. Well, here's the problem. Right now, we're in the middle of elections, and I was listening to these people last night. There was a debate, and I was listening to these people say, well, he just looks so much more presidential. Well, he doesn't really act presidential. Well, he doesn't, his language is more. And so what are we looking at? The outer appearance. We're not looking at the heart of these men or women. And so I think, because this is what God did, it says he doesn't look at the outer appearance, he looks at the heart. And so when you're thinking about, and we're thinking about judging someone or electing someone to be the king of our nation, then we probably should be looking at their heart and praying about, God, give me the eyes to see their heart, and not just their rhetoric or their words, but help me to watch their actions and see where their heart is, right? And God knew David was a shepherd boy. And this boy had no pretense. Here we are, all 7 brothers. God doesn't choose any of them, not even Eliab, the big handsome one, right? But he chooses David, and David goes on. And in the first 10 chapters of 1 Samuel, everything David does turns to gold, right? He can't do no wrong. And everything is then he gets this, the whole story of David and Goliath. And we talked about killing the giants in your life, right? And so here's he was definitely an unlikely hero. Because remember, he goes up there, and it's like, beat it, run. You just want to be seen in a battle. Split. And that was his brother, right? And David's like, well, you guys are letting this king boss us around, and he doesn't even love God or know God. We know God, we're God's people. What are you worried about? And so he's the only one, this little scraggly-headed, freckle-faced kid that steps up and smacks his little boy in the head with a rock, kills him. Any of them could have done it, but he's the only one that believed God to do it. And so then we talked about killing giants in your life, and I asked you to name your giant, right? Because some of us, your giant is, my daughter is pregnant out of wedlock. My son is in prison. I have a cancer scare. The doctors are telling me my ticker's given up. My mate left me. Whatever it is, we all have giants. And if you don't have a giant now, you will face one at some point in your life. It could be the fact that you're just looking for meaning and purpose, and it's not coming. And that in itself can be a huge giant. When you feel like, which is where we ended last week, isn't it? Where David finally came to that place. Because he goes from killing this king, which is really interesting, right? And by the way, I heard this morning by somebody, I think it was Jennings Franklin, and I thought this was really good. He said, why did David choose five rocks? Remember when he was going to kill Goliath? He picked up 5 rocks. And he said, why did he do that? Because he said he had to have a weapon in case he missed him. So his point was, if you haven't defeated your giant in your life with prayer, maybe you need to reach into your bag and grab fasting. If that hasn't worked, then maybe you need to grab a group of people together and start praying about it. If that doesn't work, maybe you need to start praising your way to victory. So you have all these different rocks, right? And I thought that was kind of a good analogy for this. Then we looked at the characteristics of true friendship, because David's friend was, and this is the weekend, I wish you'd been here, Molly. Who was David's best friend? Jonathan. I wish you had been here that weekend because we were talking about best friends being knit together in soul. That's kind of the way, that's why we're still friends after 50 years. A long time, right? So, I mean, a long time. And you know what? I'm going to tell you something. And I may have told you this in another message, but at one of the lowest ebbs in my life, in the darkest cave of my entire life, it wasn't my family that was standing by me. It wasn't the current friends that I had. It wasn't the church. It was Monty. He came all the way from Denver, showed up on my door unannounced and said, I'm here. And you know what? So I know what this is. I know what this means. And I'll never forget that as long as I live, of how special that was. And Cynthia knows how precious that was to me as well. Of course, she stood by me during that time as well. But then we looked at how David had every crutch removed. He was leaning on his wife. He was the commander of an army, remember? He was the big cheese, second only to Saul. And then all of a sudden Saul gets jealous of him, throws his spear at him. He loses his job, he loses his position, he goes to his wife. She gets him out of there, he loses his home, loses his wife, then he goes to Samuel. Samuel was his mentor. He loses Samuel because he said, you got to beat it, kid, he's going to kill you. Because remember, Saul's on a rampage. We're going to look at that really close today. And then once he goes there, he goes to Jonathan, and him and Jonathan being best friends, and they have to split apart. Jonathan gets killed in a battle. David loses his best friend. He's leaning on all of these people and all of these props and all of these things to try to find strength and comfort and courage. And then he goes, to the priest. He loses his pastor. And then he limps off and he goes into this cave that we talked about last week in 1 Samuel 22. And this was the cave of Adullam. And remember, in this cave, this was he crawled in there as a worm, really just feeling like, I'm at the end of it. All props are gone. I have nothing. I have no one. I've lost everything. God, you anointed me to be king. What happened? I mean, he was at the lowest ebb. And it was almost comical because all of a sudden, here comes a trickle of people. And he just wants to be left alone in his cave by himself. Don't bother me. And we know how that feels because we've all been there. And he's in this cave, and here comes his brothers that were condescending. And then here comes his dad, who really didn't recognize him any other time in his life. And then here comes 400 other men. Other worms, 400 more worms. They crawl in there with him. And then what happens? He could have just said, you know what, I'm going to find another cave. Because we looked at this cave of Adullam, right, where he slinked in there. And so he didn't, what happened was instead of getting bitter, he chose to get better. Instead of going through it, he chose to grow through it. And so he took these 400 men and he did what with them? He became the captain. He wound up training them and they became his mighty men. And then 200 others slink along and they join up. So you got a 600-man guerrilla warfare. That's basically what he taught them. He taught them how to do guerrilla warfare. He worked in the style of Robin Hood. Or I showed you the picture of William Wallace from Braveheart. That's exactly what he was. He was a maverick. Because God wanted a maverick king. And so, this is how so this is why I showed this picture right here. Because he's developing him from this shepherd into this mighty, great king who makes just as many mistakes and stuff as you and I. Now, this was the slide we ended with last week, and I wanted to give this back to you because I want us to think about this. God always leads us one step at a time in life. Be open to what he has for you. This is what David had to learn. Okay, I've lost everything. All right, now I'm in my cave. It looks real dark, it's cold, it's lonely, it's dismal, it's disillusioning. I don't understand. And then all of a sudden God leads him to the next step. And then he leads him to the next step. And then he leads him to the next step. Pretty soon he's on the throne, the best king that Israel has ever had. And he made some blunderous mistakes. But how he handled those mistakes is what made him this man after God's own heart. It's what made him such a great, strong man. Remember, Jesus is from the bloodline of David. So this is just a quote that I think we need to think about, because when you look at the life of David, you have to remember, brighter days are ahead. My best days can still be tomorrow. My dreams aren't realized, but they're coming, and I know they can happen. But you got to believe that. And you can't just stay in your cave and go through it. You've got to grow through it. You've got to let God handle this. All right, so now, today, let's just look at this. And have you ever, let me just ask you this question as we start today's. Have you ever wanted to get even with somebody? I think this is, I think this is life's most subtle. You guys all look so pious. Why? Certainly not. Me, I'm a Christian. I'm in the church after all. You knotheads, you're just as bad as me. I mean, all of us have wanted to get even at one point or another. I don't care who it is. You may be thinking right now, oh, yeah, you bet I've got about 3 of them right now. Right? Now, I may have told this story years ago, but I'll tell it again because I think it's good. There was a little cook. He was in the Marines. And this little cook, he was a little tiny little Chinese guy. And his name was Yao Ming. And Yao Ming had the best attitude. And these guys, these Marines, had just teased every cook until they were just brokenhearted. And they would quit, or they would go to their commanding officer or whatever. They'd get mad, they'd fight, they'd throw things, kick things, quit cooking, whatever. But Yao Ming just kept the best attitude. Nobody could get to him. Well, these guys were determined they were going to do it. So they went in and they put like sticky stuff on the stove knobs. And he was like, he didn't say a word. And they were like, Yao Ming, did you notice your stuff on the stove? Oh, I saw it, yes. Well, all right. So then they said, let's nail his boots to the floor. So they nailed his boots to the floor. And that didn't rile him a bit. Didn't bother him one bit. They turned the heat up on one of his food things and burned it. No bad attitude. They gave up after several attempts at everything, and they came up and said, Yao Ming, we're going to quit. We're quit teasing you. He said, you quit? No more sticky on the stove knob. No more. We can't get you riled up. We can't get you mad. No, we've never seen anybody like you. He goes, no more nail boots to the floor? No more nail boots. No more burning food. No. Oh, so very good. No more spit in soup. Come on. Whose soup have you been spitting in? You see, this is the thing, is it's actually, I think getting even is one of the more subtle temptations that we have. I'll get even. And after all, I have my rights. What rights does a dead man have? Right? And the Bible says that we have died with Christ. And so we really don't have those rights. Now we have been given the power to be able to give and try to treat them right. But it's a whole different story when you're holding on to this grudge. I want to show you a verse. How do you deal with the people? Now, this is a verse out of 1 Samuel. I'm going to give you quite a few verses today because I'm trying to walk you through the Bible, the story, all right? This is in 1 Samuel. This takes off from where we were last week. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. Now, I love this. Now you need to understand, Saul didn't just pursue David for a month. He didn't pursue him for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. He pursued him for years and years. And David had to put up with this guy for years. But look what it says. But God did not deliver him into his hand. So at any point, God could have said, I'll let you find him. But God was the one that kept him from finding him. So who's pursuing you? Who's trying to hurt you? When we defend ourselves and when we jump in and we try to fix it, God will let us do that and we'll mess the whole thing up. But he says, if you'll let me be your defender, I'll take care of it. And I'm facing a cancer scare. But God is there. Yes, but you see, I just lost my loved one. But God is there. Right? Yeah, but you don't know the boss I've got, but God. My dream's never going to come to pass, but God can make it happen. So hold on to that, because I think it's really extremely important. Now, some people, I don't know about you, but I know people that have a tongue that could open a wine bottle. And, now, what I want you to think about is those people in your life. I want you to think about this morning, the people in your life, or as one person said, like Job's wife. Remember, Job's wife had a tongue that you could trim a hedge with, right? You know people like this in your life. You have people that are treating you like that. They've got this, they're mean. They're unreasonable. How do you deal? It's okay to deal with, unkind or once in a while, but when you have a constant, everyday pursuit in your life of somebody that's just mean or out to get you in some way, that's hard. It's very hard. So I want to ask you, do you have any spear chuckers in your life? Is there anybody chucking a spear at you? Come on. It might be the spear of criticism. It might be the spear of slander. It might be the spear of lying to or about you. It might be a spear of rejection. It could be a spear of hatefulness, disloyalty, whatever it is. You might have spears of unkind words, whatever it is, coming at you. How are you handling that? Okay? Because I think when we look at David now today, and don't try not to read too far ahead of me, because we have a certain thing here I want you to pick up on as we go. Now, this says when Saul came back after dealing with the Philistines, because what happened was he was on his way again. He found out where David was. He went and got 3,000 men. Now that looks something like this. Okay. Now this is like just a school. That's probably about 100 men, right? Imagine 3,000 men. You think 3,000 men might be able to take care of David and 600? Probably not. They were guerrilla warfare. Now David trained these guys in the cave of Adullam to be SEAL Team 6. I'm serious. This was 600 Navy SEALs. That's how he trained them. For that day, they were trained like no other. Because remember how David was a fierce warrior. And that's why Saul made him a commander, right? Well, so Saul he knows, well, we better get 3,000 people then, because David will whoop our tail. Okay? So he's going after him with 3,000 people. And what happens is he gets derailed, and they said, well, the Philistines have come back in, they're attacking Jerusalem. They have to turn around and go back. Then he comes back, now as he's in pursuit. It says that he was in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Now I'm going to show you a couple pictures of that in a minute. It's a pretty tough. The best he could find in all of Israel were these 3,000 men, all right? And he set out in search of David and his men in the region of the Wild Goat Rocks. Now this is in En-Gedi. This is the terrain, and what it is basically David knew, and that's why it's called the strongholds of En-Gedi. Because he could get places, he knew Saul and his old boys weren't going to be able to get up there. But David had a group of men, they could go where the goats couldn't go. Right? They could climb in places where only goats could get to. And that's where they made their fortress. They had the high ground. Everybody knows the guy who has the high ground has got the edge, right? So here's David. He's up here in this area, but it's not all just goats and ugly. He's also, now remember the caves of En-Gedi. I don't know if you can see that, but there are several little caves up in there. And they're hiding out in these caves. And you're going to see the providence of God happen here in just a minute, right? Out of all of these caves in En-Gedi, and this is like 600 feet, or 600 feet above the Dead Sea, all right? And it's at kind of the southwest of Israel, and it's extremely dry and dirty, but it's not all. Some of it's kind of pretty. There's this little spring there. I can't wait to see this. I mean, I'm on it. You know, y'all know how bad I want to see it. You might be able to see this slide a little better. There's some of those. These are caves. Now those look little, but these guys, look at how they get up there. Now they didn't have the climbing gear we have nowadays. Okay? Might have had a rope. So you got some guy crawling up in here, and it's like, come get us, boys. Just come get us. All right? And then let me give you one other here. Well, I'll wait. I'm going to hold. There you go. There's a picture of that spring. It's really pretty. Now let's move on. He says he came to some sheep pens. This is Saul and his men. He came to some sheep pens along the road, and there was a cave there, and Saul went to relieve himself. Now what would you say if you were me right now? Come on. What's this mean? Well, it means Saul went into the cave to take a dookie. All right? He had to go to the bathroom. Right? David and his men were huddled far back in the same cave. Now, this is where you see the providence of God. Saul just happens, out of all these caves, Saul just happens to go into the cave that David and his men are in. Now, if there was ever a time that David could get even, and his men were like, here's your chance, David, look at that, not him. He just came into the cave to do nature's business. You got him. Go get him. Ever had friends like this? What do you think I ought to do? I'll leave them. What do you think? Knock their head off. Kill them. I mean, come on. I've had friends who were, that was their whole thing. It wasn't to resolve the problem. It was to, you know, and we don't have to have a lot of encouragement, do we? I had a principal I worked for one time, and she was riding a Harley up the street, and I was in a big truck. And boy, she was giving everybody in that school a hard time, and everything in me just wanted to go. Just being honest. That's terrible. Well, I'm still a human being, and that's exactly how I felt. And I didn't need much encouragement, but boy, there's a whole lot of teachers. Why didn't you just run her over? Oh, you should have just splattered her right on the street. Yes, I know I should have. I would have liked to. I would have liked to. But, all right. So then he's in the same cave. Now, how is it that this happened? Because God now has another lesson in David's life. I'm going to bring this man, and I'm going to put your worst enemy, and I'm going to bring him by himself. All of his men are out there. This is the king. He doesn't want to be seen in here. So I'm just going to stay in this cave. And there he is, all by himself. And God has given him a choice. Now, I've told you the story about the time that I could have shot the stepfather that murdered my mother. I know how this feels. I had my scope on this guy sitting in a truck. Long story about how he got off and he was still hunting. But I had the chance. And that was one of the biggest turning points in my life, was that day when I had to forgive that man instead of killing that man. I really wanted to kill him. I even walked up to the truck and I thought, I'm going to beat him. I'm going to beat him to death. I don't want to use a rifle. I'm going to beat him to death. And God got a hold of my heart and gave me a forgiveness. Now, I did ask him, very sarcastically, if he was still hunting with the same deer rifle. But I just told him, I want you to know that I've given my life to Christ. God has forgiven me and I forgive you. And I went over the hill, threw my deer rifle, and just sat down and cried for probably 2 hours. Because that was one of the biggest releases in my life. I wonder, in David's heart here, I just wonder if there was just this guy pursuing him and saying, what am I? Now you have to keep in mind, David's done nothing to deserve this. Nothing. David wasn't trying to get the throne. God called him. Okay? He didn't do anything. He never done. I mean, you get in trouble a lot of times because of stuff we do, but he had done nothing. Right? Sounds kind of like Jesus, doesn't it? David's men whispered to him, can you believe it? Now that's what they're telling him, go kill him. All right? Now let me ask you, what would you have done? If that was you, think about a person in your life right now that's chucking a spear at you. What would you have done? Just be real honest. Kurt's he's like, empty the clip, right? Oh, come on. Let's just be real honest. It's like, man, and I could go into, here's some things here. Now listen, I actually have a picture of this, and that probably horrifies you, but here it is. All right, so there's Saul. He's doing his business. Now, what David does here, let's look in verse 5 through 7. First principle that he's learning right here, right? He immediately felt guilty, right? In other words, he was conscience-stricken. So what happened was there is a sorrow that leads to repentance, and then there's a sorrow that leads to condemnation. You're worthless, lousy, no good. That is not from God. That condemnation comes from the enemy, Satan. But God has a sorrow that leads us to repentance. David sneaks up on him, and he knows he could have whacked his head off. He could have put a knife in his back, but old Saul's robe is laying there, and he just cuts off a piece of it. Right? Now, I think David knew what he was doing the whole time. He said to his men, God forbid that I should have done this to you, my master. So, as he's in this cave, and Saul starts to leave, David is just heart-wrenched. I should never have done that. I lowered myself to a bad standard here. And so there's where we're at right now. And let me just read it to you as I put up this picture, because there's David, and it says he was on his face. Listen to what he says. He said to his men, God forbid that I should have done this to my master, God's anointed, that I should so much as raise a finger against him. He's God's anointed. And David held his men in check. See, his men were like, get him, go get him, man. Get him, this is your chance. And David's like, God forbid, that's God's anointed. And I'm going to tell you the principle here in just a minute. Here, I'll just tell it to you now. Here's the principle I think David has learned. Because this is the second point. He was practicing a righteous principle. And that righteous principle is this. You cannot displace or replace what God has put in place. Right? You cannot displace or replace what God has put in place. That's the second principle. So he's got a deep grief, and he's conscience-stricken over the fact that he could have done this, and he can feel the hatred in his heart. And then he was a smart aleck, and he went and cut off his robe. Right? And then I'm just going to kind of paraphrase through this, because he tells him, all the stuff he could have done. And then he comes out to Saul, and he said, my master. Let's see if I can pull this one up. Then David stood at the mouth of the cave and called to Saul, my master, my king. Saul looked back, and David fell to his knees and bowed in reverence. And he called out, why do you listen to those who say David is out to get you? This very day, with your very own eyes, you have seen that just now, in that cave, God gave God put you in my hands. My men wanted me to kill you, but I wouldn't do it. I told them that I won't lift a finger against my master. He's God's anointed. He has a healthy respect for authority, doesn't he? This is huge. Oh, my father, he calls him. Because they had that relationship. It was father-son. All right? Then he says, look at this piece that I cut from your robe. I could have killed you. In other words, I could have taken your head instead of a piece of silk. Right? But I didn't. Look at the evidence. I'm not against you. I'm no rebel. I haven't sinned against you. And you were hunting me down to kill me. You ever had somebody do that? You're doing nothing but good to them, and they're trying to destroy you. They're trying to destroy your reputation. And in the middle of this? Boy. All right. So, it was also against the law to kill the king. Whose responsibility was it to remove Saul? David's? It's God's responsibility. Why? Because he said, what is mine? Remember? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. It's not yours, son. Not yours. It's mine. I will repay. I will take care of it. So if you attack something that God has put in place, you're attacking God. You just have to keep that in mind. So wisdom says, now this is something I want you to think about, because David was being very wise here. Back to this. He's being very wise. And wisdom says, I don't want to look back in my life and regret something. In other words, if I do what I'm about to do, is this going to ruin my dreams, my goals, my hopes, my future? Now, there are many of us in this room have probably done things in our lives that have either done that or slowed the process down. Okay? I could tell some stories on you all. And myself as well. Okay? But David knew this. He didn't want to have to tell the story. Can you imagine? Daddy, tell us how you, Grandpa, tell us how you became king. Well, you see, Saul snuck into the cave. He had to relieve himself, and he was in there, and I snuck up behind him, and I cut his head off when he wasn't looking. Oh, Daddy, you're so brave. Come on. What story would that be? But to say God exalted me in the midst of all of my enemies, right? And so David knew that. And he also knew that history showed that whoever murdered a king had the same thing done to them. So if you murdered him, you were going to get murdered. So then he goes on and he tells him, who do you think I am, a dead dog, a flea? And he's like, why are you pursuing me? Well, then Saul goes into this extremely, let's go to that verse real quick. Okay, he goes into this extreme remorse. When David had finished saying all this, Saul said, can this be the voice of David, my son? Or my son David? And he wept in loud sobs. You're the one in the right, not me. Because David right before that said, let God judge between us. And he said, you're the one who's done it right. And then he said, you heaped good on me, and I've dumped evil on you. Now, if you think about us with our enemies, a lot of times we're heaping evil on them. We're replacing evil with evil. Tooth for tooth. Lie for lie. Slander for slander. Fist for fist. Right? And that's our way of handling these things. You've heaped good on me, and I've dumped evil on you, and now you've done it again. Treated me generously. God put me in his hands, because remember this happened once before. You put me in your hands, and you didn't kill me. Why, when a man meets his enemy, does he send him down the road with a blessing? May God give you a bonus of blessings for what you have done to me today. And then he goes on and he talks about, I just can't believe you had this chance and you didn't do it. But then it says, and you can't miss this, look at this last part, it's why I highlighted a different color. Then Saul went home. David went back with his fellows to the wilderness and his wilderness refuge. Well, if everything was all honey and no bees, then why didn't he go back with Saul? I'm like, hey, things are good between us. I'm going back with you. I'm going to live in the palace. He didn't, because he knew Saul all too well. Do you know your enemies that well? Do we know our main enemy that well, old Forky Tail? That we know that, the tricks and schemes are still there. I'm not going home with you, right? And so I need to I'm going to stay with my boys. We're going to the hills, and I'm glad you're all happy. Okay, I'm giving you 3 practical applications to take out the door, and we're done. Here is the first one. So these are in this application, what I want you to think about is, when you're deciding on options, should I retaliate or not? Should I forgive or not? Should I get even or not? Just like David was in this place, all right? Now, this is your first principle that I think David was learning there. Does this option violate God's law? For example, love and forgiveness. What is Jesus? Jesus said, I have a new commandment. What's my new commandment? That you love one another, right? He said, a new commandment do I give you, that you love one another. Okay? Well, that love shows itself in a lot of ways, doesn't it? In fact, that is the best form of evangelism there is when people see Christians fighting and bickering and being mad and mean. What happens is, it kind of turns them away from Christ. And so, I was thinking about this evangelism thing. There was this barber. And this barber had taken an evangelism class, right? I just think this kind of didn't really know if it fits or not, but I think it's good. So he's taking this evangelism class, and he learns how to start a conversation with somebody, and how to, I'm going to lead you to Jesus Christ, and how do I do that? And so he learns all the stuff, and he memorizes all the verses, and then he says, all right, his first day on the job, he's cutting somebody's hair, and he thinks, all right, I'm going to talk to somebody about Christ by 9 o'clock. So he's sitting there cutting his old boy's hair, he chickens out. All right, by 10 o'clock, chickens out. By noon, I'm going to do it. Chickens out. So it gets to be about 3 o'clock, and he's like, he's starting to get a little bit, feeling really guilty. It's like, Lord, I'm failing. I took this class. I ought to be able to do this. 3 o'clock comes, he still can't do it. He says, that's it. I close at 5. At 5 o'clock, he said, that's it. I am going to witness to somebody. And so at 5 o'clock, the last guy walks in. He walks over, he shuts the door, and he locks it, and he pulls down the shade. And the guy's thinking, that's kind of funny, And so he's getting his hair cut. And he's trying to work up the courage, and he goes blank. He can't think of anything. He can't think of anything. And he's over there working this, the old Strothen strap in the braids. In fact, that Strothen strap is what my grandpa used on me as a kid. It said Mike's Barbershop. To this day, I have Mike's on one cheek, Barbershop on the other. Red letters outlined in blue, I'm telling you. So here he is. And he's working this thing, and he's just getting more scared. So he's going really fast, and he finally comes to his mind the question to ask. He's like, are you ready to die? So he gives him the gospel, I guess. Anyway, I don't know how that fit in here, but again, we're talking about love and evangelism, right? Love is the best evangelism there is. When somebody sees that we have, now I had this opportunity, and I'll be honest with you, I was able to lead several people to Christ and had them come to church regularly when I worked at City Market in Grand Junction, because we had a boss. I told you, it was the Antichrist. Sure. And the way, I wanted to throw in just like everybody else. In fact, we had one meeting, they're like, hey, Bruton, you do all the talking. You're really good at talking. You do all the talking. We all feel this way. And I'm like, okay. You got my back, right, boys? Yeah, we got your back. I'm like, all right. So we called a meeting. We sit down with him, and I'm whittling away, and I'm like, and this is how we all feel, sir. This is this. Right, guys? Right, guys? Nobody said a word. Left me there to be gutted like a deer. And so it was like, oh, all right, you idiots. So now I'm starting to get mad, and I'm starting to feel the same way. And I thought, you know what? I have a choice here. I have a choice, and the choice is lead by example. And so I would start trying to do good, and I would sing praise songs, and I would start witnessing, and I would be just happy and friendly and everything else, and change my whole attitude, and that changed their lives. They gave their life to Christ, some of them, because of the fact that they saw that I chose not to retaliate. And I'm making that story really short, because there were some serious things this guy got fired because of some of the stuff he was doing. But listen to this quickly, and then I'll on this principle. Does this violate, if I'm about ready to get even, does it violate God's law? God's law is that you love one another, that you forgive, right? But look at this one in Romans, and this is, I think, an important verse. Bless those who persecute you. That's what Jesus said too, right? Don't curse them. Hey, if they flip you off, don't flip them off back. I know Christians that do that. They got a dove on their car. They got a fish on their car, and they're flipping people off. Yeah, I'm serious. Okay? I've seen it. Or, if you buy somebody, if somebody, that's why I always said I'm never going to have one of those on there, because I'll probably blow it, because half the time I like to ball them out anyway, but still. All right, so pray that God will bless them. Be happy with those who are happy, and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Live in harmony with each other. That takes fine-tuning and time together and stuff, doesn't it? Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. In other words, don't think you're better than everybody else. And don't think you know it all. Verse 17, never pay back evil with more evil. Hey, don't knock out a tooth because they knocked yours. I'm not talking about self-defense. Okay, don't misunderstand. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can. Now listen, do all that you can to live at peace with people. It's easy for us to do the least amount, right? It's easy for us to say, okay, I'll go so far, right? And in our flesh, I'm going to go so far, but I'm going to stop there, right? But do all you can to live at peace with everyone. Everyone. That means lousy boss, boyfriend that's whatever, who knows. Okay? Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will take revenge. I will repay. God will. He's going to do it, but you've got to let him do it. And he says, verse 20, instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will keep burning coals on their head. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil with good. And then this one, Matthew 5:23. I love this verse. So if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there, and then go and be reconciled to God. So when you come to your little prayer meeting, and you say, oh dear Lord, thank you, give me, and forgive me, and whatever else we do, and we're doing our little thing, and the Lord says, hey, remember Sam? Yeah, but Sam's a jerk. I called you to love jerks. Yes, Lord, but you don't understand this one. This guy has doing everything he can to ruin my life. I mean everything he can. Now anyway, Lord, what I was saying is, I want you to go take care of Sam. You need to go take care of Sam. Go make it right. But Lord, you don't understand. You're asking me to do something that's almost impossible. Yep, and that's what I'm here for. I can help you do the impossible. You can't do it on your own. But I can help you do the impossible. All right? I feel like Don Knotts when he loses his... You ever see the ghost of Mr. Chicken when his notes all blow away? You ever seen it? You need to watch it. It's awesome. Okay. All right, so the second one, quickly. Your second principle right here. Does this option violate a principle? Okay. Does it violate his law? Does it violate... So in other words, Lord, I'm going to get even with that person. But what's the principle? I won't take revenge. The principle is don't ever take revenge. I'll do the revenge for you. Okay? I've got hornets as big as guinea hens, and I'll send them on before you. Remember what he did for Moses? But now here, I asked the Lord one time, I said, Lord, how many times do we have to forgive that idiot? How many times do we have to just let this go before he can finally give up? And here's what the Lord said to me. He said, you know what, son? Just down in my heart. He said, you can quit loving him and give up on him when I quit loving you and I give up on you. Wear that one out the door. That's a tough one. That's right where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? And I know I'm just going a little bit longer, but there's just some stuff here I think you need to see in this verse. 1 Peter 3, 8 and 12. Be tenderhearted, keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. For the scriptures say, if you want to enjoy life and see many happy days, keep your tongue from evil and speaking lies, or evil, and your lips from telling lies, and turn away from evil and do good, search for peace and maintain it. The eyes of the Lord are to watch over those who do right, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the Lord turns his face against those who do evil. Now, this is the last verse, I promise, but I want you to see this. Because this has to do with somebody that's dealing with the unreasonable. Yes, but you don't know my boss. You don't know my mate, right? Check this out. You who are slaves, employees now, right? You who are employees. You must submit to your masters with all respect. They don't deserve respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. For God is pleased when conscience of his will, because of conscience of his will, you patiently endure unjust treatment. There are some people in this room who have received some very unjust treatment. Of course, and just recently, okay? Of course you get no credit for being patient if you're beaten for doing the wrong thing. But if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. And for God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow in his steps. Jesus was, isn't he the perfect example? Have you been spit on and had your beard and stuff just yanked out and beat beyond all human recognition? You know when they did the Passion of Christ, people are just appalled. They're like, holy moly, he looks like hamburger. No, he still looked like a human being. They didn't get it right. He was beat way beyond what they showed in the Passion of Christ. Have you been treated that bad yet? Have you been put on a cross and nailed there for doing nothing? You were guilty of love in the first degree? Yes, but my boss. Really? Jesus died for you and for your boss. He died for you. That's who he died for. This unlovely, unreasonable people. Third thing. Okay. Is it the wise thing to do? Okay, I'm making this decision on whether I should retaliate or get even, like David had. Will this help or hinder the goals and my future and my dreams? So in other words, take everything to its logical conclusion. All right, here's what I did. I'm going to put it right between these eyes. What's the logical conclusion? They find out I go to prison for life. Or I live in my own personal prison. Nobody finds out. But I live in my own personal prison of knowing that I lowered myself to the same standard as him, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. So take it to its logical conclusion, right? So with your enemy right now, well, I'm going to slit his throat. Really? Take that to its logical conclusion. I'm going to beat him up. I'm going to quit my job. You got 3 hungry kids. You know, so you have to, what's its logical? Take everything to its logical conclusion. Think about that in every decision. And are my advisors, the people that are advising me, like David's advisors in the cave, are they violating the law of God, the principles of God, and the wisdom of God? And here's your last slide. We need to expect to be mistreated. Expect it. If you're a Christian, Jesus said you're going to get persecuted. You're going to get, you know, if you're shining, and if they beat him up, and if he lived this holy life and people didn't like it, they're not going to like it in you. And when we try to do the right thing. And anticipate feelings of revenge. We all, because we're depraved, we all have these feelings. Now I could have this message right now. And walk out of here and go to Walmart, and some little boy cut out in front of me, and everything I just said goes right out the door. Because I want to pull him out of that truck and work him over. Right? Let's be honest, it's like, my family will tell you, you know, it's like, easy, Dad. Because there are certain things, it's like, because we have our rights. He said, I want you to lay your rights at the foot of the cross. Let go of the revenge. And the last thing is, don't refuse to fight the flesh, because the flesh says, hey, oh boy, I'll get even, you watch. One of these days, when you're not looking, pal, boy, I'll get even. And you know what? And God says, I'm watching the whole thing. Here's your assignment. Your assignment is that I challenge you to find one person in your life right now that you know you need to forgive, right? And to forgive them, and to let them know that you're forgiven. Tell them specifically. And sometimes I think it's hard for us, but it's really easier. It's best if you can name it specifically. I forgive so-and-so for this thing or these things. I forgive you. You know why? If you don't forgive them, you have drank poison and you're waiting for them to die. Bitterness kills the container that it's held in. Period. And so, this is our assignment. Wouldn't you like to have a new bucket list? You know, our bucket list is always, you know, we want to accomplish a whole bunch of stuff in our life before we kick off. But what if we had this bucket list that said, you know what, I want to have stuff, I want to accomplish certain things every day of my life that bless and help other people. Like I want to give, let's say I find a single mother raising 3 kids, you know what, she could use a new wardrobe. I'm going to do that for her. That's on my bucket list. See? Kind of changes things a little bit, doesn't it? Then I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But rather to think about the others. And that's what all of these verses that we've talked about today, that's what they're talking about. Put the Lord first in this whole thing. Live in harmony. So Father, this morning we just, we give you thanks. And Lord, as we look at David's life, Lord, it's a refreshment to see that he was such a bonehead failure, just like the rest of us. Because now we're going to go on to see how he let go of this bitterness, but now he has to deal with Nabal. And he doesn't do so well with Nabal. And so Lord, he just kind of lives the same life as us. He seems like he's on a roller coaster of success, failure, success, failure, success, failure. And Lord, a lot of us live there. And so I thank you for this great man. But more than anything, Lord, just the patient work that you did in his life every day to make him the man of God and the great king that he was. And so, Lord, help us to learn these lessons, and these are one of them. Help us to know how to respond to those who mistreat us. And we just pray in Jesus' name. Amen.